July 8, 1920. The Ritz Hotel, Piccadilly. A Royal Air Force ball, the kind of gilded evening post-war London's aristocracy had invented to tell itself that the world was still ordered, that the chandeliers could still compete with what the previous 6 years had left behind. Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 19 years old, 9th of 10 children of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorne, educated privately at the family seats at St. Paul's Walden and Glamis Castle, already established in her social circle as the magnetic one. Biographer Sally Bedell Smith would later call her the it girl of her aristocratic set. She had the specific quality that would define her publicly for the next 8 decades, the ability to make every person in her immediate radius feel individually chosen. Prince Albert, second son of King George V, danced with her that night and fell in love. He would spend the next 3 years making sure she knew. There were 2 sons of the king moving through the social world of 1920s London. The second one, Bertie, as the family called him, was 24, the Duke of York, chronically anxious, possessed of a stammer severe enough that public speaking was a visible ordeal. His elder brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, was 26, heir apparent to the British throne, and was becoming the most photographed man in the empire. Edward had toured Canada and Australia and the United States and charmed entire nations with an ease that looked like pleasure rather than performance. He wore his clothes with studied negligence that was itself a form of statement. The press treated him with the particular reverence that attaches to the luminous, to men who project appetite for life while appearing not to need it. These 2 men moved through the same rooms as Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in the early 1920s. One of them fell for her at the Ritz. The other barely registered her existence. The popular compressed version of what followed has become its own mythology. Elizabeth, the story goes, had her eye on David, the heir, the glamorous one. David wasn't interested, or was briefly and not seriously, or simply never considered her as a viable possibility. She waited, the story goes, for as long as the first option remained open. When it didn't, she accepted the stammering second son, moved into the palace that should have housed the other one, and spent the next 5 decades ensuring everyone around her paid for the discrepancy. This version can't be proven from the available primary record. That needs stating plainly, and meaning it. No letter from Elizabeth to Edward survives expressing romantic feeling. No diary entry, no contemporaneous witness account places them in a private exchange that went beyond normal aristocratic social interaction. Sally Bedell Smith, who had access to royal archives and private papers while researching the fullest recent biography of the marriage, stated without qualification that Elizabeth scarcely knew the Prince of Wales. William Shawcross, who worked from the Royal Archives as official biographer, with access to private correspondence that no outside researcher has seen, found no documented romantic connection between them. The Daily Express reported in October 2022 that the story of Elizabeth having wanted to marry Edward may have originated with Edward himself, described as a cruel rumor he invented or spread in later years. The man who gave up an empire for Wallis Simpson may also have retroactively inserted himself into his brother's marriage as the woman's first choice. Hold that detail. Return to it later. What can't be disputed, confirmed in the primary letter record and across multiple biographies, is the documented shape of the courtship itself. Albert proposed to Elizabeth in 1921. She refused. He proposed again before March 1922. A letter from Albert to Elizabeth survives in which he apologized for proposing without giving you any warning, which is a very specific apology for a very specific event. It confirms the second rejection in plain terms, written in his own hand. He proposed a 3rd time on January 13, 1923, at St. Paul's Walden, the Bowes-Lyon family home in Hertfordshire, reportedly during a walk on the grounds. She said yes. The engagement was publicly announced the following day. 2 years, 3 proposals, 2 refusals, and a yes that required another full year to arrive after the second rejection. Elizabeth explained her hesitation in letters that have survived, and the language she chose is worth sitting with precisely. She was, in her own words, afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. The loss of personal freedom that royal life demanded was her stated reason. Multiple biographers, Shawcross included, with the full archive in front of him, accept this explanation as genuine. It's probably honest, as far as it goes, but it has a complication the standard account tends to move past. Albert's equerry, a young Scottish officer named James Stuart, described by Bedell Smith as both handsome and attentive, was also in Elizabeth's social orbit throughout the entire same period. Bedell Smith places her dancing with Stuart at the Ritz on those same evenings in 1920. Stuart was an alternative, an attractive aristocrat who could offer a comfortable, stable private life without the crown's weight. He eventually left Albert's service for a better-paying position in the American oil industry. The timely removal of a rival, in Bedell Smith's phrasing, was among the factors that finally cleared Albert's path to his third attempt. If Elizabeth had been holding out for David, the James Stuart detail would be irrelevant, a social footnote. But if Stuart was the actual alternative she was genuinely weighing, the real reason for her hesitation, then the 2-year pause had nothing to do with Edward at all. It was genuine ambivalence about whether she wanted a royal life, sustained while a non-royal option remained present. When that option took a job in America, the available field narrowed, and she accepted the proposal that remained. This reading is more honest than the romantic legend. It may also be more accurate. What it does not explain is everything that happened after 1936. April 26, 1923, Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth's dress was deep ivory chiffon moire, embroidered with pearls and silver thread, designed by Madame Hanley Seymour, in what contemporary papers described as suggestive of a medieval Italian gown. She wore a chaplet of leaves rather than a tiara, the veil borrowed from the Queen. On her way into the Abbey, in a gesture the palace described as unprecedented, she laid her bridal bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior, in memory of her brother Fergus, killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. The BBC wanted to broadcast the ceremony by radio. The Archbishop of Canterbury vetoed the request on the grounds that men might listen in public houses. The wedding cake was 4 tiers high, 3 meters tall, 350 kilograms, baked by McVitie and Price. Albert wore RAF full dress in the rank of group captain. Elizabeth became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. They honeymooned at Polesden Lacey in Surrey, and then traveled north to Scotland, where she contracted whooping cough, which the newspapers carefully noted was unromantic. The contrast between them was immediate and never significantly changed across the 29 years of their marriage. Albert's stammer turned public speaking into visible, effortful struggle. The preparation before each sentence, the moments where a word seemed to resist being said, the recovery. Elizabeth was the woman who, during a 1927 tour of New Zealand, accidentally reached the end of a formal receiving line and found herself face to face with a stray dog that had wandered into the ceremony. She extended her hand and shook its paw. The room dissolved into the kind of warmth that can't be manufactured. He was formal, prone to the sudden consuming tempers his family called gnashes, carrying the anxious perfectionism of a man who held himself to a standard he always found himself failing. She was spontaneous, fluid, able to work a crowd with an attention that felt personal, even when it was entirely practiced craft. Cecil Beaton, the society photographer who documented the royal family across several decades with the professional precision of someone whose business was constructed image, found the exact formulation that everyone who knew Elizabeth in private reached for: a marshmallow made on a welding machine. The softness was real. The steel beneath it was also real, and it was precisely what the softness depended on to function. In 1926, the same year their eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was born, the Duchess arranged for Albert to consult Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist who had established a Harley Street practice following the war. Logue's approach was unconventional. Specific breathing exercises, physical posture adjustments, techniques formal medicine had not formally endorsed. They worked. His diaries, discovered by his grandson Mark Logue and published in 2010 with co-author Peter Conradi as The King's Speech, document years of intensive treatment beginning in 1926. Elizabeth appears in them as a consistently supportive partner, grateful for the improvement and protective of the relationship between her husband and his therapist. The diaries contain nothing to suggest she mocked his difficulty, exploited it socially, or used the public contrast between his stammering and her verbal ease as a personal asset. This point needs stating clearly. The argument does not require, and the available evidence does not support, the claim that Elizabeth was secretly cruel to George in their private life. The marriage produced documented warmth. His letters to her express profound attachment. George VI called the family unit "We Four," himself, Elizabeth, and their two daughters, with evident pride in the compactness of it. What the argument requires is something more specific than private cruelty, that she managed the dynamic of their public partnership with sustained sophistication, consistently positioning herself as the more socially capable half of a constitutional partnership, and that this management served her own requirements at least as much as it served his. The stammer was his problem to solve. Her visible support of the solution became one of her most reliable public assets. Eleanor Roosevelt hosted the couple during their 1939 North American tour, designed to build transatlantic solidarity with the war now legible on every horizon. Roosevelt's private assessment of Elizabeth, recorded in her correspondence, isn't flattery. Elizabeth was perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. Not naturally regal, self-consciously so. The performance was visible to a sufficiently attentive observer, even when it was also genuinely skilled. By 1935, the marriage was 12 years old, and the constitutional disaster was fully visible to anyone watching. Edward, the Prince of Wales, now within months of becoming king, was publicly and comprehensively in thrall to an American socialite named Wallis Simpson. Twice married, her second divorce in progress, her hold over the heir apparent alarming to everyone who witnessed the actual texture of the relationship. At a dinner in late 1935, a guest watched Edward get on his hands and knees to release the hem of Wallis's dress from the leg of a chair while she criticized him in the hearing of the room. He had written to a previous lover that he was the kind of man who needs a certain amount of cruelty. His official biographer, Philip Ziegler, noted that there must have been some sort of sadomasochistic relationship, that Edward relished the contempt and bullying she directed at him. At Sandringham that December, 3 weeks before his death, George V stood at the bottom of a staircase and shouted up at his eldest son, "You've got to get rid of that woman." 3 weeks later, George V was dead. Edward was king. The abdication crisis of late 1936 is constitutional history. What is less often examined is the view from inside the household that was about to inherit it. On January 20th, 1936, George V died at Sandringham, and Edward ascended as Edward VIII. The assessment of those observing him closely was uniform and alarmed. Inattentive to his government papers, contemptuous of ceremony's function, conducting his relationship with Wallis Simpson with an indifference to institutional consequence that stopped just short of provocative. Through the summer and autumn, the crisis gathered in slow, visible increments. Wallis's decree nisi was granted in October. The king's private secretary, Alec Harding, wrote to the king in November, warning formally that the press silence around the affair couldn't hold. Edward told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin on November 16th that he intended to marry Wallis as soon as she was free. Baldwin made clear that no such marriage could be accommodated. On November 20th, 1936, the Duchess of York wrote a letter to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary. Biographers describe it as horrified in its tone. She understood precisely what abdication would mean for Bertie, a man who had structured his entire psychological life around not being king, who had watched his elder brother occupy the center his entire adult life, and had organized his sense of himself around the useful, manageable, secondary role. The stammer alone made the prospect of kingship a particular kind of dread. The Christmas broadcasts, the state speeches, the addresses to Parliament, all of it suddenly concrete, inevitable, and terrifyingly close. The constitutional machinery closed in through December. The Dominion prime ministers rejected Edward's proposal of a morganatic marriage, him retaining the throne, Wallis receiving a lesser title rather than becoming queen. Edward held his position. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, he signed the instrument of abdication in the presence of his three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. The following evening, from Windsor Castle, in the broadcast that became the most famous royal statement of the century, he said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." Albert became King George VI on December 11, 1936. Elizabeth, at 36, became Queen Consort. Their coronation took place on May 12, 1937, the exact date that had been reserved for Edward's coronation, meaning the throne they occupied had been fitted precisely for someone else. Elizabeth never forgave Edward for the abdication. Every major biographer states this without qualification. The Telegraph, reviewing the Shawcross-authorized biography in September 2009, recorded her settled conclusion that Edward had been bemused with love and that she never forgave him for it. Hugo Vickers, in a Country Life interview drawing on decades of research into the royal family, put the precise shape of her anger. She blamed Wallis unfairly for causing the abdication, and thus hastening the death of the king. The word unfairly is Vickers's own qualifier. Elizabeth didn't regard it as unfair. She maintained the attribution, without perceptible softening, for the rest of her life. The authorized biographers consistently frame this anger as loyalty to George. And they aren't wrong to do so. George VI died on February 6, 1952, at Sandringham, from coronary thrombosis. He was 56 years old. His malignant left lung had been removed the previous September, under the public description of structural changes. He had smoked 2 packs a day throughout the war, under the relentless accumulated pressure of a role he had never sought. The wartime broadcasts that required him to conquer, in public, the stammer he had spent decades managing, the constant exposure, the psychological burden of a man who had entered the job under the worst possible conditions and never found stable footing. Elizabeth believed, with documented and consistent conviction, that the abdication had effectively sentenced her husband to early death, and that Wallis had written the sentence by keeping Edward unmovable from his catastrophic choice. George VI became king at 40. He died at 56. 15 years. She spent 50 years more as the woman he had left behind. This is a real grief, with documented evidence behind it. It does not need embellishment. and it does not require a romantic backstory to explain why Elizabeth despised the abdication and the people who produced it. Except it does not, on its own, explain that woman. Anne Seba's 2011 biography of Wallis Simpson took its title directly from Elizabeth's standard form of reference. Not Wallis, not the Duchess, not even Mrs. Simpson after the marriage. For decades, across documented private correspondence and reported conversation, Elizabeth referred to the woman Edward had married as that woman. A definite article and a pronoun, the minimum acknowledgement that a person existed, stripped of name and title. Seba documented the sustained refusal as a form of controlled hostility, presenting Wallis as Elizabeth's designated hate figure, the woman held responsible for allegedly ensnaring a British king. Wallis, for her part, called Elizabeth Cookie, reportedly because of her supposed resemblance to a fat Scots cook. The nicknaming was mutual. The contempt was mutual. The power wasn't. In June 1937, 6 months after the abdication, George VI issued letters patent creating Edward, the Duke of Windsor, with the style of Royal Highness. The same letters patent specified, with deliberate legal precision, that the title didn't extend to his wife and descendants, if any. Wallis became Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor, not Her Royal Highness. Legal historian Robert Blackburn, examining this document, identified it as an instrument specifically designed by Sir John Simon to draw a formal institutional line between the Duchess of Windsor and the royal family. It was to Edward's everlasting hurt and anger, in Blackburn's phrasing. At every social occasion, every introduction of his wife, every protocol question at every reception and state dinner they attended in their decades of Parisian exile, the missing 3 letters made their point precisely. Elizabeth supported the denial. Every biographer confirms this. Whether she personally drove the specific legal engineering or aligned with a collective palace decision can't be established from available sources with certainty. Her support is documented. The decision held for the remaining 49 years of Wallis's life. Royal biographer Ingrid Seward reached for a specific word to describe Elizabeth's sustained attitude toward the Windsors across those decades: vendetta. Not institutional distance, not principled constitutional objection, vendetta. The distinction matters. Grief resolves or changes its texture. Institutional constraints respond to changed circumstances. Vendetta persists actively. Vendetta requires deliberate maintenance across decades, across events, across rooms where you might otherwise simply have done nothing. The question worth asking is, what account, precisely, remained unsettled across 35 years of sustained social execution? The mainstream biographer's answer: her husband's health, his shortened life, the abdication's damage to the crown. This is real and sourced and deserves to be taken seriously, but it does not, by itself, account for 3 decades of active social erasure, a maintenance that continued long after any institutional purpose was served, long after the constitutional crisis had been resolved and the Windsors had been effectively contained in French exile, long after George VI had been dead for a generation. It does not explain the refusal of a name. It does not explain an animosity that serious royal biographers describe with the vocabulary of personal vendetta rather than institutional policy. Whatever Elizabeth had or had not felt about David during those 2 years of proposals and refusals, and the private record can't tell us, and needs to be said as clearly at the end of this argument as at the beginning, she watched, from the throne that fitted someone else, a man who had not chosen her declare publicly that he couldn't discharge his duty without the woman he had chosen instead. He chose Wallis with the kind of conviction that bent the entire constitutional order of the British Empire. He announced his reasons to the nation in a broadcast heard around the world. That announcement had a specific living audience of 1, standing in a palace that had belonged to the second son of the king since the first son walked out of it. When Wallis came to Buckingham Palace in May 1972, just before Edward's funeral, to spend time in the orbit of the family who had defined her exclusion for 35 years, she was 75 years old and already visibly diminished, the neurological decline that would consume her final years already establishing its territory. She was given appropriate formal hospitality. She wasn't incorporated into the family circle. Edward's funeral took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on June 5, 1972. The Queen Mother attended. Contemporary accounts describe her behavior as formal and measured. Wallis sat through the ceremony and returned to Paris. She died on April 24, 1986, after years of near-total incapacity in the house in the Bois de Boulogne, under the control of her French lawyer. She was buried beside Edward in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore. Edward was buried there because in 1970, the Queen had agreed to his request, made through his lawyer, Sir Godfrey Morley, to be interred in the charm and seclusion of the family burial ground, rather than the isolated rhododendron glade originally designated. The Queen, by that point, had maintained a quiet, affectionate private relationship with her uncle, signing her letters to him, "With love from your affectionate Lilibet." Queen Elizabeth II met Edward approximately 6 times in the 35 years between the abdication and his death. The warmth of those meetings was hers. The consistent, decades-long maintenance of his exclusion from the family's central life had been shaped by other decisions made closer to the throne. Elizabeth spent 50 years as Queen Mother. She is the longest-serving holder of that role in British history, and she used the time with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that longevity in a peripheral royal position is itself a form of power. The public performance was extraordinary. It was also exactly that, a performance, executed with sufficient skill that 3 generations of British people never noticed the mechanism. She attended racecourses in her signature pastel coats and matching hats, broad smile deployed for crowds who adored her in return. She opened hospitals and launched ships, and visited regiments and attended memorial services. She was photographed with the consistent contentment of a woman at peace with her circumstances, and the photographs were invariably published because they were invariably charming. When approval ratings for other members of the royal family collapsed during the various crises of the 1990s and beyond, hers remained intact. She was the Queen Mum. She was the national grandmother. She was the last link to the generation that had stood in the rubble of bombed streets and refused to budge. Behind this, the financial record tells a different story. The Financial Times reported in March 2008 on a 1959 financial crisis within the Queen Mother's household, describing what her servant, Sir Arthur Penn, had managed quietly. A serious financial shortfall in her accounts. This wasn't a one-time difficulty. The Queen Mother maintained what multiple sources describe as hundreds of thousands of pounds in personal debt. An overdraft, effectively covered by the sovereign, accumulated across the decades of her widowhood through the expenses of her household, her racing interests, the staff required at Royal Lodge in Windsor and at the Castle of May, the remote Scottish property she purchased and renovated after George VI's death in 1952, her private retreat from a public role she had never, in fact, relinquished. The Castle of May purchase is itself a piece of psychological data. She acquired a derelict castle on the Caithness coast, at the northernmost edge of Scotland, the most isolated, significant property in the royal portfolio, within months of her husband's death at 56. She restored it. She returned to it every year for the rest of her life. Tina Brown's 2022 book, The Palace Papers, noted that the Queen Mother bitterly resented any glimpse of daylight shed on royal magic, a phrase that does not describe someone who had made peace with the gap between institution and reality, but someone who understood the gap completely and had chosen, as a matter of operating principle, to keep it dark. The equerry memoir, Behind Palace Doors, written by someone who served in her household, described the Queen Mother's daily routine with a specificity that mainstream biographical accounts tend to pass over. Her first drink of the day arrived at noon, and was a gin. The drinking wasn't the squalid, destructive kind. It was the high-functioning, embedded, entirely socially normalized kind that the British upper classes of her generation had elevated to ritual. She drank, she remained coherent, she performed, she drank again in the evening. Her physician and her staff accommodated it. The public received the pastel coats and the smile. J.H. Plum's History of the Period, in a passing observation, described her as one of the cardboard characters that royal mythology had produced, noting her gin bottle with the dry deflation of a professional historian who found the hagiography irritating. George VI's private secretary, when asked to define the Queen Mother's political philosophy, offered a formulation so perfect in its compression that The Guardian quoted it in Tanya Gould's 2009 essay. It was best summed up, he said, by all things bright and beautiful. A Victorian hymn celebrating the natural order, everything in its proper place. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them, high or lowly, and ordered their estate. This isn't the political philosophy of a woman who found herself in the castle by accident and felt the awkwardness of it. It's the philosophy of a woman who believed the castle was precisely where she belonged, and who had organized an entire moral framework to confirm that conviction. The Guardian essay Gold, published in September 2009, occasioned by the release of the Shawcross authorized biography, was titled with a directness that the obituary writers of 2002 had notably avoided. The Queen of Unkindness. Gold collected the accounts that the national morning press had consciously declined to include. The social coldness, the political calculation, the particular sharpness of Elizabeth's responses to anyone she regarded as beneath, threatening, or simply inconvenient. The Shawcross biography itself, despite its authorized access and its warm framing, acknowledged her capacity for hardness in ways the Guardian reviewer described as the biography being indulgent, overlong, and ultimately unsatisfying, precisely because Shawcross had access to the full record and chose consistently to look at it with sympathy. The authorized biographer, who had read the private letters, concluded that her resentment of Edward was about what he had done to George and the institution. He didn't conclude that it was about anything more personal. Shawcross's own conclusion, presented in the Telegraph review of his 2009 biography, was that Elizabeth believed Edward had been bemused with love and never forgave him for the abdication. Bemused with love. Not corrupted, not manipulated. Bemused, as if the primary problem with Edward's choice was the quality of his judgment rather than the quality of his feeling, as if choosing Wallace with that particular completeness was, in Elizabeth's settled assessment, a kind of stupidity. The framing is revealing. Edward had looked at the available options and chosen. Elizabeth had been one of the available options, in the general social sense that any well-connected aristocratic young woman of appropriate background was a possible consideration for the heir. He had not chosen her. He had, according to Sally Bedell Smith, barely known her. Wallace was what happened when someone actually captured his attention with full, overwhelming, life-reorganizing consequence. Elizabeth's verdict that he was bemused, temporarily reduced in cognitive capacity by the wrong woman, preserves a hierarchy. She remained the sensible, the stable, the appropriate. He chose badly. She had not been among the bad choices. Whether she believed this, and whether believing it helped, belongs to the sealed record that Shawcross had access to, and chose not to fully excavate. The behavioral account remains available. The Duke of Windsor spent his final years in Paris, aging in the house on the Route du Champ d'Emprennement, in the Bois de Boulogne. His declining health attended by a French lawyer named Maître Suzanne Blum, who would eventually, in the assessment of Hugo Vickers's research, effectively capture Wallis in her own incapacity and manage the Windsor estate for her own purposes in the years after Edward's death. Prince Charles visited his great-uncle before the end. In a detail Vickers recovered, the head gardener at Buckingham Palace, a man named Nutbeam, who had worked with Edward as a young man before the abdication, encountered the Duke during a 1965 visit to the palace gardens, arranged by the Queen, discreetly, away from press photographers, during Edward's recovery from an eye operation, and the two men recognized each other with immediate, uncomplicated warmth. The gardener, the former king. An entirely human encounter arranged in secret because the public architecture of the family had no room for it. Edward died on May 28, 1972. Wallis survived him by 14 years, the last years of her life spent in a seclusion that was partly chosen and partly arranged by the lawyer who controlled her deteriorating affairs. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore in April 1986. The Queen Mother outlived both of them by 16 years. She died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, peaceful and attended and aged 101. She had outlived her husband by 50 years, her brother-in-law by 30, Wallis by 16, and very nearly outlived the century that had made all of them. Her funeral was watched by the kind of crowds that confirmed the success of the performance, enormous, emotional, entirely convinced by the image that had been maintained across decades of careful management. The national coverage described her with the vocabulary that had accumulated around her across 50 years of public life. Beloved, indomitable, the wartime spirit in a hat, the woman who had stood in the bombed streets of the East End and made Londoners feel seen. These things were true. She had done them. She had also, with complete efficiency and sustained determination, spent 50 years managing the exile of the people who had humiliated the institution she had been given, ensuring that the woman who bore the name of the man who had not chosen her could never receive a three-letter title, could never be incorporated into the formal life of the family, could never occupy any public space that might suggest equivalence. What the crowds who wept in the mall in April 2002 were mourning was real, in the sense that the thing they had been given was real. The warmth was real. The public courage was real. The continuity she represented was real. What was also real, and what the authorized biographers had access to and declined to foreground, was the woman behind the pearls, the one who referred to another woman by an article and a pronoun for decades, who maintained an overdraft that ran to hundreds of thousands of pounds, while the country associated her name with cheerful self-sacrifice, who started each day at noon with a gin, and whose political philosophy was summarized by a Victorian hymn about the natural order. There is one final detail worth settling, because it belongs at the end of this account rather than the beginning. The claim that Edward VIII made up the rumor about Elizabeth wanting to marry him, the story that forms the ironic foundation of everything that followed, appeared in the Daily Express in October 2022, reported as a cruel rumor Edward had invented or spread. If that reporting is accurate, then the man who gave up an empire for the woman he chose also took some care to insert himself into the marriage of the man who replaced him, placing himself retroactively as the prior option, the better offer she had lost. He made himself the explanation for her resentment. He made the whole narrative, if it circulated as a story among the Windsor circle, about him. Whether he invented the story or whether it had any basis that he simply amplified, the result is the same. A version of the last century of British royal life exists in which the beloved Queen Mother was secretly pining for the dramatic king who renounced everything. It's a tidier story than the one the evidence actually supports. The one the evidence supports is less romantic and considerably colder. a 19-year-old woman from a Scottish aristocratic family who was weighing a Scottish officer with no constitutional obligations against a nervous second son with a stammer, who waited until the Scotsman took a job in America, then said yes to the proposal that remained, and who spent the 50 years after her husband's early death executing a sustained institutional vendetta against the man whose choices had driven him to his throne, and the woman whose name she refused to say. There is no proof of prior heartbreak in that story. There is documented fury, documented freezing, documented financial extravagance, and documented lifelong maintenance of another woman's humiliation. There is a nation that gathered in April 2002 to mourn the loss of a dignity it had been carefully sold for 8 decades by someone who understood with complete professional precision exactly what she was selling. She wanted David, or perhaps she simply wanted the better offer. She didn't get him, or perhaps she had never genuinely tried. She took George, whom she may have genuinely loved and who, by all accounts, genuinely loved her. She outlived him by 50 years, spent those years being adored, and ensured throughout that the woman wearing the Windsor name paid a visible, sustained, institutionally enforced price for it. A nation worshipped her for it. That's not irony. That's the performance working exactly as designed. Subscribe for more stories like this.